Robb Stark remembered the sound of the Grecians' laughter echoing against the ancient stones of Riverrun's great hall as the news was brought to him. Walder Frey, Lord of the Crossing, was prepared to let the young wolf and his army cross the twins, but only on the most stringent conditions. Robb was to marry one of Lord Frey's daughters. The demand had not been a surprise in itself. Lord Walder was known for using his many children to weave alliances and bargains. But it felt like a heavier burden on the young king in the North's shoulders than any sword he had ever borne. Time had slipped through Robb's fingers. He had lost his father's life in the jaws of King's Landing, and he was as good as an orphan. Ned Stark was gone, executed on the orders of King Joffrey in that accursed city. Robb had been declared king in the North by the lords who had gathered under his banner. He was preparing to match the Lannisters blow for his father's death and the indignities suffered by House Stark. Crossing the twins was pivotal to any plan he had to strike south against Tywin Lannister's army. Walder Frey had them in a vice. Either Robb agreed to the marriage and the other demands, or his forces would remain stranded before the fords of the Green Fork, stymied before they could strike back at the Lannisters. Catelyn Stark had pleaded with her son to consider this carefully. Lord Walder might be a weasel in temperament, but his stronghold was crucial. Any slight or insult toward him could cost Robb not only the crossing but also the goodwill of the Riverlords, especially since many of them were kin to or well acquainted with the Freys. The man was old, petty, and prone to dramatic gestures. She had known him well in her girlhood, whenever she had visited the twins with her father, Hoster Tully. Once offended, Walder Frey would be 1,000 times harder to mollify. Even the great Jon, brash and fearless, had grumbled that they needed the twins more than they needed the old man's anger. For a time, Robb vacillated, thinking of the lines drawn across Westeros, of Sansa trapped in King's Landing, and of Arya missing. He was no fool. He knew that alliances made in haste could bring bitterness. Yet the war demanded it. So that fateful night, he made the choice that would change the course of the war, and perhaps the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. He accepted Walder Frey's original demands without complaint. The crossing would be theirs in exchange for a marriage to one of Lord Walder's daughters. Arya, if she were found, would eventually marry one of his younger sons or grandsons. In return, the Freys would supply Robb's army with men and would open the gates of the twins to allow passage south. Walder Frey's lips had twisted into a self-satisfied smirk as soon as Robb, swallowing his pride, gave a solemn vow and promise to keep his word. Word traveled with the speed of ravens. The Frey forces assembled, and the calls went out for the families to gather. Walder Frey had many sons and daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, nieces, and nephews. The entire brood swelled the walls of the twins, teeming like ants in an overturned anthill. The crossing was opened, and Robb and his loyal lords rode through. The wedding was to be arranged swiftly, to seal the bargain. Robb Stark knew the significance of each step he took as he rode through the gatehouse. The din of men, horses, and arms hammered through his ears. He tried to keep his shoulders squared and his gaze unwavering. After all, he was the king in the North, a boy in years but tested by warfare and sorrow no one his age should have faced. If the marriage was the price to free his army from stagnation on the wrong side of the Green Fork, then so be it. Lord Walder wasted no time. He greeted Robb and his mother with cold civility, just enough courtesy to avoid open insult. He inspected Robb like a merchant appraising a fine mare, his watery eyes flicking across Robb's face. "Here he is," the old man said in his papery voice. "The young wolf, come to my hall to wed my daughter. I do hope she doesn't disappoint your lordly expectations, your grace. So many unwed girls in my family, you see." He gestured vaguely to the cluster of young women, some plump, some angular, some smiling, some staring at the floor. Robb nodded stiffly, remembering his mother's warning not to let slip any expression that might give offense. He must show approval or risk shaming whichever daughter he refused. But Walder Frey actually selected a daughter for him. Roslyn, a mild, pretty girl with soft eyes and a shy manner. She was a flower in a house full of weeds, something that piqued the curiosity of many. The court whispered that Lord Walder was choosing to curry favor with the king in the north by giving him the fairest daughter he had. Or perhaps Rosalind had been the only one he dared risk giving away to a man as valuable as a king. Robb found Rosalind's kindness a breath of fresh air amidst the malice and bitterness of the twins. She was not graced with the striking beauty of highborn ladies like Marjorie Tyrell or the elegant Dornish princesses, but she was pleasant to look upon. She spoke quietly but never rudely. She blushed whenever she caught his eye. Despite the circumstances, Robb found it surprisingly easy to smile at her. The wedding was arranged in haste. The Freys were not about to let the young wolf slip through their fingers without sealing the contract. The great hall of the twins was decked with faded banners of House Frey, mostly gray on blue, the two towers connected by a silver bridge. The smell of roasting meats and fresh bread would have been inviting had it not been for the near-suffocating air of tension that lingered throughout the corridors and courtyards. Everywhere, eyes peered from behind columns and across galleries. The Frey men, freckled or watery-eyed, seemed to be taking the measure of the Northmen, trying to decide if they were truly worth risking the Lannisters or even the Iron Throne's displeasure. Though Walder Frey had become a new father many times over, he greeted the wedding with a tired, almost mocking sense of humor. He teased Rosalind about her trembling hands. He made crude jests at Robb's expense. But the ceremony itself passed without serious incident. Robb Stark, guided by the Septon's words, placed a gentle hand over Rosalind's. The look they exchanged was one more of duty than of love, and yet it held a seed of camaraderie that could grow into something genuine, if given time and care. When the wedding ended, and the last solemn vows were said, the music began in earnest. The feast followed. Walder Frey presided over a night of forced merriment, with minstrels singing and jugglers juggling. Great jugs of wine were emptied, roasted boar devoured, and stewed fish served in abundance. Catelyn sat near her son, quiet and watchful. The great Jon guffawed at every bawdy joke. Roose Bolton observed from behind half-lidded eyes, ever unreadable. Black Walder and Lothar Frey cast glances at each other with the occasional cunning smile, as though they wondered if they had truly netted the king in the north. But Robb's brow remained furrowed long after the night's festivities ended. The taste of wedding cakes and honeyed wine did little to sweeten the reality. He had bound himself to a family he did not trust, all for the sake of a crossing. Yet he would do it again, if it meant saving the honor of his father's memory and ensuring the survival of the North. With the vows honored, Walder Frey had no cause to delay Robb's host any further. The portcullises were raised, the drawbridges lowered. Ser Ryman Frey and several others, including the newlywed Rosalind in a wheelhouse, accompanied by retainers, joined Robb's march. It was an uneasy marriage of forces, some thousands of Frey men mingling among the Northmen, river lords, and others sworn to the king in the north. Catelyn, traveling in her own carriage, often looked from Robb's tent to the Frey encampment with a silent worry. She prayed that they had done right, for the cost of crossing Walder Frey was too high if somehow this union turned sour. But the immediate effect was unmistakable. With the Freys on his side, Robb had reinforcements to guard his flanks. He also gained precious time. He could move south more quickly and outmaneuver Tywin Lannister. Indeed, the old lion, so dreaded by many in the Riverlands, soon found himself confounded. News reached Tywin that Robb Stark had allied properly with the Freys and was now fielding more men than anticipated. Battle lines shifted. Edmure Tully, from Riverrun, bolstered by the knowledge that Walder Frey's men would reinforce him as well, became more daring in his strikes against any Lannister outriders that ventured too close. Plans that might have once allowed Tywin to sweep in through the Riverlands became more precarious as the twins now guarded an unbroken front. It grew clearer by the day. Walder Frey, for all his cunning and pettiness, had made a choice that might turn the tide of the war if the Lannisters could not woo him back. Yet the old man was cautious. He never declared open rebellion against the Iron Throne in any letter. He merely fulfilled his obligations to his new liege lord, Robb Stark, and waited for more developments. Should the tides shift, Walder Frey was likely to shift with them. Robb knew this all too well. He knew that loyalty from the twins was fragile. But it was enough for now to push forward. The first real test came not long after the crossing, in a field near Oxcross. Tywin had sent a large contingent under the command of Ser Gregor Clegane and Ser Amory Lorch to harass Robb's outriders, burn villages, and draw him out. Instead, Robb lured them into a night attack. His scouts had discovered the Lannister encampment, and with the help of Grey Wind, Robb guided a force of Northmen, Riverlanders, and Freys through a hidden ravine. It was a bloody, vicious battle under the light of the moon and torches. Wolves howled, swords clashed, and men screamed as tents went up in flames. The Freys, although not known for their valor, fought fiercely under the watchful eyes of the Northmen, determined to prove themselves. The Greyjohn's roars mingled with the snarls of Grey Wind as Robb's men forced the Lannisters into disarray. The result was a decisive victory for Robb Stark. Ser Gregor was wounded badly enough that he had to retreat, leaving Ser Amory Lorch to rally what men remained. The latter lost his life when his horse was cut out from under him, sending him tumbling into the mud, where a dozen swords found him. By morning, the Lannisters' camp was in ashes, and those that survived scattered into the countryside. Robb had proven, once again, his cunning on the battlefield, and now he had the Freys to spread the tale. In the aftermath, Robb made a point of recognizing the courage of the Frey men. He spoke to Ser Ryman Frey personally, praising their discipline in the heat of battle. He visited Rosalind after the fighting, still wearing dirt and dried blood, to assure her that he was well. She met him with trembling hands and teary eyes, giving him a shy smile that conveyed her relief. Robb took that moment to place a gentle hand on her cheek and promise to keep her safe. It was a moment of warmth in a realm of blood and steel. His mother, however, studied him carefully. Catelyn saw a flicker in his eyes, guilt, worry, the weight of a choice that he knew was shaping his destiny. He was still so young, forced into the shoes of a king. No one could truly be prepared for that. The following weeks saw Robb's army moving deeper into the western lands, raiding Lannister-held territories, and drawing the forces of the crown out of position. Whispered news reached them that King Joffrey, in King's Landing, was preoccupied with the sudden approach of Stannis Baratheon's fleet in the Blackwater Bay. Tyrion Lannister, acting as Hand of the King, had his hands full trying to defend the city. Tywin Lannister was forced to reckon with Robb's growing threat in the west, yet also felt the pressure to keep King's Landing reinforced. All these pieces, swirling on the great board of war, gave Robb an advantage that might never have emerged had he been stuck at the Twins, or if Walder Frey had withheld men. The strategic gain of Walder Frey's alliance became more evident with each passing skirmish. All the while, alliances were tested. Roose Bolton, ever the quiet observer, looked upon the new arrangement with the Freys with an inscrutable face. Yet for the time being, he kept his own counsel, leading his men as required. The Karstarks grumbled about the Freys, but they could not deny that additional forces strengthened the host. Lord Rickard Karstark brooded about avenging his sons, who had died at the Whispering Wood, but the war was far from over, and he needed every man to see that justice done. Robb took counsel with his mother frequently in the nights, bent over maps by candlelight. The letters from her sister, Lisa Arryn, in the Vale were ambiguous at best. Lisa was hesitant to involve herself in open warfare, no matter Ned Stark's death or the presence of her niece. The Vale might remain closed, too fearful of Lannister reprisal. Yet even with the Vale's inaction, Robb was confident that the war's momentum was shifting. He turned his attention to forging new alliances. If Walder Frey would honor the crossing and the marriage vow, might others follow? Might the Brotherhood without banners, rumored to still roam the Riverlands, begin harassing Lannister supply lines? Might the Tyrells break with the crown if they sensed a weakening in King's Landing? So many questions. He found himself spending his evenings more often with his new wife, Rosalind. Initially, their marriage had been but a pact of necessity. However, in the quiet moments when the two shared dinner, or walked together briefly before night fell, Robb saw a glimpse of the life he might have had if not for war and vengeance. Rosalind was gentle, and though she seemed frightened by the fierce Northmen around her, she worked to learn their names, to offer small kindnesses wherever she could. Her softness reminded Robb of the things he was fighting for. Not just power, but peace and safety for the North, an end to the bloodshed, a realm where sisters could be free of fear and younger brothers would never have to ride to war. It was at one such quiet time, as they camped near the ruins of a once proud tower, that the news came that Stannis Baratheon had lost the Battle of the Blackwater. The Lannisters, aided by House Tyrell, had crushed Stannis' hopes beneath a wildfire inferno on the Blackwater Bay. King's Landing was secure, Joffrey still sat the Iron Throne, and Tywin Lannister was returning to the field with a vengeance. Catelyn saw the lines deepen around her son's eyes when he heard. He knew that he would eventually have to face Tywin at his full strength, for the Tyrells had thrown their weight behind the Lannisters. Now the Crown's forces were greater than before. The realm had turned in a new direction, but Robb was not deterred. He had learned that cunning and swift action could defeat even a larger host. The victory at Oxcross, the capture of Jaime Lannister at the Whispering Wood, and the forging of alliances all offered a lesson. It was better to be clever than simply strong. Yet he could not remain in the West forever. Sooner or later, he would have to decide whether to press toward the heart of the realm or secure the North. Word eventually reached them of Balon Greyjoy's rebellion in the North. Theon Greyjoy, whom Robb had considered a friend and brother of sorts, had betrayed him and led Ironborn raiders to strike at Winterfell. The news struck Robb like a physical blow. He realized that in the swirl of alliances and war councils, he had lost sight of the Iron Islands' ambitions. They had seen the chaos as an opportunity to carve out their own kingdom in the North. He slammed his fist onto a wooden table the night he heard that Winterfell had fallen, cursing himself for letting Theon go. A hush fell in his tent as Catelyn, the Great John, Roose Bolton, and Ser Ryman Frey all waited for the king in the North to speak. Grey Wind paced outside, growling softly, sensing his master's agitation. Robb declared that he must return north. The North cannot suffer Ironborn reavers, he said. They spit on the memory of my father. I will put an end to Balon Greyjoy's pretensions. The Great John agreed eagerly, hoping to tear apart the Ironborn. Ser Ryman Frey looked uncertain. Crossing back and forth between the North and the Riverlands was not trivial. But Walder Frey had promised men, and these men would follow Robb's orders. And so, Robb Stark changed course, mustering his forces to move north again, to reclaim Winterfell. He left a portion of his host, mainly Riverlanders, under Edmure Tully's command to hold Riverrun against any Lannister aggression. He also left some northern banners to help Edmure, lest Tywin strike at the Riverlands again. Rosalind accompanied Robb. She could have stayed behind in Riverrun or even at the Twins, but Walder Frey insisted that she remain with her husband. Perhaps he wanted her to be a constant reminder that House Frey had bound its fortunes to the king in the North, or perhaps he thought she would glean valuable information to send back to him. Rosalind dutifully followed Robb wherever he went, even though she grew increasingly anxious as they traveled through the war-ravaged Riverlands. By the time Robb's army reached Moat Cailin, he received messages from loyal northern houses, begging him to come swiftly. Reports said that the Ironborn had seized Deepwood Motte, Torrhen Square, and White Harbor was under threat. Worst of all was the news that Winterfell itself had been taken. Theon Greyjoy, having once served as Robb's ward, now sat in the seat of House Stark. Robb's blood boiled, but he tempered his fury with clarity. He would face Theon if it was the last thing he did. Crossing the Neck proved easier this time, as the Crannogmen had little reason to oppose Robb. Lord Howland Reed remained elusive, but he allowed Robb's armies to pass unharassed. The Freys, for their part, were less eager to press so far north, grumbling about the swamps and the damp, but they followed nonetheless. They had pledged their swords, and even if they might later regret that oath, they would not break it so soon. When the banners of the North swirled through the gates of Moat Cailin, the men cheered. The Great John called out, "The King in the North! The King in the North!" And the chant spread like wildfire. Rosalind Frey, clad in a warm fur cloak, watched from a safe vantage, her eyes wide, as rough-bearded northerners roared their approval of Robb's return. They might have their misgivings about these southern Freys, but they revered Ned Stark's son. From Moat Cailin, Robb sent out swift riders, calling on the northern lords to rise up. Many had already done so, but they needed leadership, a cohesive plan to drive out the Ironborn. The Karstarks answered, though Rickard Karstark's eyes were still haunted by the losses he had suffered. The Manderleys from White Harbor sent word that they were mustering ships and men, preparing to defend their city from Ironborn longships. The Boltons, led by Roose's bastard son Ramsay in the Dreadfort's domain, had begun savage raids to push out the Iron Men. It was a fractured front, but Robb believed they could succeed if they coordinated. He pressed on, determined to relieve Winterfell first. News reached them that Theon Greyjoy held Bran and Rickon Stark as hostages. That news struck an anguished chord in Robb. He had suspected they might be in danger, but hearing it confirmed from multiple sources left him anxious and seething. His two youngest brothers, in the hands of a man who had once been their companion. When the host of the king in the north finally closed in on Winterfell, the sight of blackened walls in places and the scorched fields around the castle brought tears to many an eye. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of the old stables. The banner of the Kraken, the sigil of House Greyjoy, hung limply over the gates. It was an abomination. Robb wasted no time. He ordered siege lines formed, archers at the ready, and battering rams prepared. Ser Ryman Frey's men took positions on the flanks, while the Northmen formed the center. Roose Bolton, quiet as ever, placed his men to envelop any Ironborn who tried to sally out. Grey Wind prowled restlessly by Robb's side, eager to tear into the foe. Inside Winterfell's walls, Theon Greyjoy must have realized the hopelessness of his position. He had only a small Ironborn garrison. Stark bannermen were gathering in droves outside his ramparts, out for blood. It was rumored he had but a few dozen men left who were loyal, while the rest were either dead or defected. He tried negotiation. He tried to send a message out to parley, insisting he would kill Bran and Rickon if they did not allow him safe passage. Robb, grim-faced, refused. He knew it was a bluff of desperation, but he also knew Theon was unpredictable. Hours stretched, the tension thick. The battered gates of Winterfell were not meant to withstand so many foes, nor was the fortress meant to resist a full-scale assault from its own rightful army. Many inside the castle might have turned on Theon if given the chance. At dawn, when the horns sounded, Robb ordered the ram forward. Arrows whistled through the gray sky, lodging in timber or in the flesh of defenders atop the walls. Theon's men tried to dump boiling oil, but they had too little to matter. The first splintering crash of the ram brought a roar from the assembled Northmen. A second crash followed, and a third, until the weakened gates gave way. Through the smoke and dust, Robb Stark led the charge into Winterfell's courtyard, Grey Wind bounding ahead with snapping jaws. Ironborn reeled back, many dropping their weapons or fleeing in panic. The Great John loomed like a bear in the thick of the fighting, smashing men aside with his great sword. Frey men joined the fray, though many were hesitant to risk themselves in the front lines, adding their blades to the melee. But the day belonged to the north. Robb personally dismounted in the courtyard, looking for Theon, for his brothers, for any sign of them. In the confusion, men shouted and died, but Winterfell's defenders melted away before the united northern host. At last, Robb found Theon Greyjoy near the steps to the Great Keep, flanked by a handful of Ironborn. Theon held a sword in one hand, a dirk in the other. His eyes were wild, his expression desperate. "Robb, he began, but Robb did not wait for conversation. Grey Wind leaped forward, forcing Theon back. One of Theon's men lunged at the direwolf, only to have his arm torn open by snapping jaws. Theon, pale and trembling, attempted a clumsy swing at Robb, but the king in the north parried it easily. With a few swift blows, Robb disarmed Theon, knocking his sword from his grip and sending him sprawling on the icy ground. A hush descended on that part of the courtyard. Boltons, Karstarks, Manderleys, and even Freys surrounded them, forming a grim circle. Theon looked up at Robb with terror in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I never wanted. Where are my brothers?" Robb demanded, voice taut with rage. Theon swallowed hard. I tried to keep them, I did. But they're gone. His voice shook, desperation choking him. He claimed that Bran and Rickon had escaped, that they were alive somewhere, that the charred corpses he had shown everyone were just the two farm boys, not the Starks. Robb's relief that Bran and Rickon might be alive mingled with furious disgust at Theon's deception. He wanted to strike off Theon's head right then and there. He heard the Great Jon muttering that this was no time for mercy. Theon had betrayed the Starks, destroyed part of Winterfell, and threatened the lives of Ned Stark's sons. Roose Bolton offered no visible reaction, simply observing. Ser Ryman Frey looked unsettled, as though uncertain whether it would serve Walder Frey's interests for Theon to live or die. Catelyn's presence at Robb's shoulder calmed him enough to think. This was bigger than vengeance alone. Theon was the only link to Balon Greyjoy. Perhaps Theon could be ransomed, used to force the Iron Islands to yield. Perhaps the boy could be turned into a bargaining chip. Though in that moment, a part of Robb wanted only to end him. He took a breath, remembering how his father Eddard Stark had taught him the responsibilities of justice. "Take him to the dungeons," Robb ordered, voice echoing in the courtyard. "I'll decide his fate later." Theon was dragged away, shouting half-baked excuses or pleas for mercy. Robb turned to the men around him and declared that Winterfell was theirs again. A ragged cheer went up. Some men rushed to see if they could salvage what was left of the keep. Others rushed to find any survivors. Over the next few days, they discovered devastation. The outer walls had sections crumbling from fire. The ancient library tower had collapsed in part. The great hall still stood, but it was blackened by soot. Many of the people of Winterfell had fled or been killed. Robb led a grim survey of the halls he had once known so well in his childhood. He saw the nursery where once Bran and Rickon had lived. Now it was empty, ransacked. He saw the place in the yard where he used to train with Theon, hitting wooden swords against each other in mock battles. Now it was stained with blood. Yet rumors came in that Bran and Rickon had indeed escaped. Some said they fled with the wildling woman, Osha, and Hodder, the gentle giant. No one knew where they might have gone, but the hope of their survival kept Robb from collapsing under the weight of loss. Winterfell was partly in ruins, but it was free of Greyjoy occupation. That alone was something. Robb moved swiftly to stabilize the north. He dispatched loyal men to drive out the Ironborn from Deepwood Motte and Torrhen Square. He sent ravens to White Harbor, bidding them to hold strong. A new wave of northern fury rose against the Ironborn, forcing them to retreat to their longships or die. By the time winter snows began creeping down from the skies, the Greyjoy hold on the north had all but crumbled. Balon Greyjoy might still proclaim himself king of the Isles and the north, but that dream was turning to smoke in the face of Robb Stark's wrath. Amidst the reconstruction, Ser Ryman Frey made it clear that Walder Frey expected to be rewarded for his loyalty and for fulfilling the marriage contract. He pressed Robb for favorable trade privileges once the war ended, as well as certain considerations in the Riverlands. Walder Frey, it seemed, saw an opportunity to expand his power in the wake of so many lords dying. Robb, at first reluctant, realized that concessions might be necessary if he was to keep the twins loyal. The presence of Rosslyn as Robb's queen in the north complicated matters too. Some northern lords were cold to her, seeing her as a daughter of Walder Frey, that untrustworthy old man. Yet her gentle demeanor began to win hearts. She would sit with the wounded in Winterfell's halls, offering them water or a kind word. She wrote letters, at Robb's request, to her father, giving updates on the war's progress and urging him to send more men if needed. She did her part to secure the alliance, and many a Northman softened at the sight of her caring for common folk. Robb himself was torn between his duties as a king and the desire to comfort his mother, who still grieved Ned's death deeply, and the worry for Sansa and Arya in the south. He prayed to the old gods for his sister's safety. He knew Sansa was still a hostage in King's Landing, betrothed to King Joffrey, though rumors said that might have changed when the Tyrells came to court. Arya's whereabouts remained a mystery, yet for all the turmoil, something remarkable happened. The North was united under Robb more strongly than ever. House Bolton, House Karstark, House Manderly, House Umber, and others all recognized the need for solidarity to rebuild Winterfell. The old grudges between houses were set aside in the face of common enemies. Walder Frey's contingent was tolerated, mostly because they had been instrumental in helping Robb. When Winterfell's reconstruction began in earnest, it was Rosalind who first proposed a gesture that might help the war effort. She suggested that Walder Frey send masons and builders from the twins to aid in rebuilding the castle. It would be a sign that House Frey was not merely reaping benefits, but actually contributing to the North's recovery. Robb agreed, dispatching a raven to the twins with his queen's words. Walder Frey's reply was lukewarm. He would send some men, but only after the spring thaw, as traveling north in winter was too treacherous. Nonetheless, even that concession was a small victory for Rosalind, who saw it as a chance to prove the worth of her new family in the eyes of her husband's people. As the North rebuilt, Robb began planning anew for the war beyond his borders. He had not forgotten that Joffrey Baratheon remained on the Iron Throne, that Tywin Lannister was regrouped and stronger than ever. House Tyrell's involvement had made the Lannisters unstoppable in the south. For the moment, though, they had not dared march north, uncertain of the cost. One day, a raven arrived from Riverrun with dire news. Edmure Tully had been under renewed pressure from the Lannisters. Tywin, rejoined by the remnants of Ser Gregor Clegane's forces, had pushed into the Riverlands. Harrenhal had changed hands again, and the River Lords were struggling to keep the Lannisters at bay. The Freys at the Twins were supposedly holding the crossing, but the Lannisters had found ways around, or so it was said. Robb realized he would need to take the fight back to the Riverlands sooner rather than later. The northern winter was closing in, yet the war demanded momentum. If he allowed the Lannisters and Tyrells to pick apart his allies in the Riverlands, all he had achieved would be for naught. So, once the Ironborn were largely driven out of the north, Robb made a decision to march south again. He named a castellan to oversee the reconstruction of Winterfell, leaving behind a skeleton garrison, enough to keep the Ironborn from returning but not so large that he would lose striking power. He placed Theon Greyjoy in a dark, cold cell beneath the keep, guarded day and night. He did not trust the man to remain quiet if allowed any freedom. Catelyn, though weary, readied herself to accompany her son once more. She wanted to see her ailing father, Lord Hoster Tully, who was said to be nearing death in Riverrun. She also believed that her presence would help maintain alliances with her old friends in the Riverlands. Rosalind insisted on going as well, determined to stand beside her king and husband. Some part of Robb admired her courage. The host of the king in the north, now blooded in 2 campaigns, one against the Lannisters, one against the Ironborn, moved south once more. The sight of those wolf banners flying beside the cross tower's sigil of House Frey made a peculiar combination, but it was symbolic of Robb's plan, forging unity from necessity. As they descended through the neck, they heard rumors that the Lannisters had tried to bribe Walder Frey into turning on Robb. Some claimed that Walder entertained the notion. Others believed that as long as Robb kept his vow, and the king in the north had done so, Walder might see more profit in sticking with him. Catelyn urged Robb to maintain the best possible relations with the old man, even though both of them loathed the necessity. By the time they reached the region of the Twins, it was late in the year. Snow dusted the southern banks of the neck, though it turned to slush farther south. They were greeted by the sight of Walder Frey's banners, but the old lord himself was not present. Instead, Black Walder and Lothar Frey came forth to meet them, leading a small complement of knights. "We hear you mean to drive the lions from the Riverlands, your grace," Black Walder said. "My grandfather sends his greetings. He regrets he cannot greet you in person, being indisposed by a chill." The sneer on Black Walder's face suggested otherwise, but Robb did not press it. They took a few days' rest at the Twins, resupplying. Rosalind went to see her family. She returned with a quiet sadness. The Twins was never a warm or loving place, and her mother had passed away a few years earlier. Robb offered what comfort he could, though he felt ill at ease in Lord Walder's cold halls. At least no insults were openly hurled his way this time. The old man was apparently satisfied that Robb had lived up to his end of the bargain, though he might still harbor resentments about not gaining every advantage he wished. Pushing onward, Robb's army marched through the riverlands. They encountered burned farms, shattered villages, and scattered peasants huddling in the wreckage. Edmure Tully and the Blackfish met them halfway to Riverrun, grateful for the reinforcement. Edmure informed Robb that the Lannisters had razed much of the surrounding area, punishing any who they believed supported the king in the north. Even the Brotherhood without banners had been stretched thin. A council of war was convened at Riverrun upon their arrival. The Blackfish, ever the seasoned soldier, believed the best chance was to strike at the Lannisters quickly, before they fully consolidated their hold on the Riverlands. The Lannister host, led by Tywin, was rumored to be near Harrenhal, with partial forces garrisoned in various strongpoints. Roose Bolton suggested a strategy of dividing their forces to harass the Lannisters from multiple angles, forcing Tywin to split his men. Edmure Tully worried that scattering might make them vulnerable to being picked off in detail. Others weighed in with opinions. Robb, eyes locked on the map, realized that the same cunning that had served him before was needed again. He ultimately decided on a plan reminiscent of his earlier successes. Feign an attack in one direction, then swiftly move to another. The Lannisters might expect him to come from the west, but he could circle around from the southeast. The key would be secrecy and speed, something that had worked well when capturing Jaime Lannister. When the plan was set, the war horns blew once more. Robb's men marched through fields turned to mud by winter rains. The Freys, though not universally loved by the Tully bannermen, participated under Ryman and Black Walder's leadership. They were, after all, part of Robb's army now. What followed were a series of engagements that turned the tide in the Riverlands. Robb managed to outmaneuver a portion of Tywin's forces, cutting them off from reinforcements at the Red Fork. Lord Tywin, forced to rush to their aid, left Harrenhal vulnerable. The Blackfish seized the opportunity, leading a swift attack to retake the cursed fortress. At the same time, Bolton's men, joined by the Karstarks, raided Lannister supply lines. The skirmishes were savage. Men drowned in the fords, arrows rained from hidden archers in the forests, and the night air was filled with screams more often than songs. Yet each time the dust settled, it was Robb's banners that remained, battered but unbroken. Walder Frey's men fought with less zeal than the Northmen, but they followed through, unwilling to earn the wrath of the king in the north or be judged by Walder for cowardice. Eventually, Tywin was forced to consolidate at the ruins of a small village near Harrenhal. The once proud Lannister host was reduced, not destroyed, but severely hampered. The Tyrell reinforcements remained in the south, uncertain of whether to risk traveling so far with winter approaching. Robb contemplated a bold move, perhaps pressing even further, attacking Tywin head-on while he was weakened. But caution whispered otherwise. The Lannisters were cornered, but a cornered lion is deadly. Moreover, word had spread that King's Landing was stable, and if the crown turned its attention fully toward the Riverlands, a massed force of Lannisters and Tyrells could still overwhelm Robb's host. Winter was creeping in, making roads treacherous. Food supplies grew scarce. The war would be decided not by a single decisive battle, but by who managed to survive the cold and starvation. The time for negotiations was at hand, or so Catelyn believed. She urged her son to consider treating with the Lannisters for peace. At the very least, perhaps an exchange could be made for Sansa and Arya. Yet Robb was torn. The deaths of so many Northmen lay on Tywin's head, as did Ned's demise. Was peace possible with the men who had executed his father and threatened his kin? Should he not finish what he started? His anger warred with his sense of duty to his people, who needed respite from war. While these doubts churned in Robb's mind, ravens flew from King's Landing to the major seats of Westeros. King Joffrey, or rather his advisors, called on the realm to unify against this usurper in the north. The letters threatened dire consequences for any lord who gave Robb support. Tywin Lannister might be pinned down in the Riverlands, but his gold reached far, and he could still bribe lords to turn cloak if Robb was not careful. And so the weeks turned into months. with skirmishes flaring and dying like sparks around the riverlands. Robb's men shivered through cold nights, huddling around campfires, telling stories of what they would do once the war ended. Some dreamed of returning home to families, others fantasized about gold or glory, but they all looked to Robb as the linchpin of their cause. Walder Frey's men started to complain loudly about the conditions, but those complaints never reached Robb's ears directly. Sergeants and knights from the north made sure to keep discipline. Ryman Frey continued to make demands for more compensation, while Black Walder glared menacingly at anyone who questioned Frey valor. In the midst of it all, Rosalind quietly comforted the wounded and worked with Catelyn to maintain a sense of decorum. She wrote letters to her father, Lord Walder, reassuring him that the alliance remained strong and that, in time, the Freys would be amply rewarded. She also sent small personal messages to some of her sisters, telling them of her experiences, hoping to bridge gaps. Despite these diplomatic efforts, there were still tensions. Some northerners spat on the ground when Freys passed, remembering old slights. Some Freys muttered that they were dying for a cause far from their own seat, for a boy king from the north who could not even guarantee them final victory. But each day that passed without open fracture was a small triumph. Robb's acceptance of Walder Frey's original demands had set them on this precarious path, yet so far it held. Slowly but surely, the advantage swung in Robb's favor. The Karstarks, finally seeing a chance for vengeance on the Lannisters, fought fiercely in every engagement, forging a path of retribution. The Manderleys, their supply lines from White Harbor reestablished, provided much-needed provisions, albeit at cost. The Umbers and other smaller northern houses came trickling in with reinforcements, braving the early snows. Even the Boltons, unsettling though they were, contributed to the fight. Facing these odds, Tywin Lannister did what many believed impossible. He opened negotiations. A letter arrived under the banner of truce, carried by a minor Lannister cousin, proposing a meeting to discuss an exchange of prisoners and potential terms. The letter named a neutral site near the Blackwater Rush. Robb was wary, suspecting a trap. Catelyn, however, recognized an opportunity. She insisted on the necessity of retrieving Sansa. Arya too, if the rumors that she might be in Lannister hands proved true. Exchanging valuable prisoners like Jaime Lannister, who still languished in Robb's custody, might be the key. A war council convened with the Blackfish, Edmure, Roose Bolton, the Great John, and the Frey leaders in attendance. They debated whether to respond to Tywin's overture. Roose Bolton advocated caution, possibly sending an envoy rather than Robb himself. The Great John insisted that going in person would show strength. Black Walder suggested that the Freys might be the ones to parley, but that was met with immediate distrust by the Riverlords, who did not want Walder Frey speaking for them. In the end, Robb decided to send a small delegation, with terms that he would attend only if Tywin came personally. Days passed before a reply arrived, and to everyone's surprise, Tywin agreed. The stage was set for a grand meeting, a parley that could decide the future of the war. On the appointed day, Robb rode forth with a chosen few: Catelyn, the Blackfish, Roose Bolton, and a modest guard of Northmen. They chose a wide, open field near the banks of the Blackwater Rush, where outriders could keep watch on the approaches and ensure no ambush was hidden. Tywin arrived in similar fashion, bringing a handful of knights and a few members of his retinue, including a pair of gold-cloaked archers for protection. What followed was a tense negotiation. Tywin wanted Jaime returned. Robb wanted Sansa, and if Arya was indeed in Lannister hands, he demanded her as well. There was talk of a possible cessation of hostilities, or even that Joffrey would recognize the North's independence. But Tywin refused to bow. He demanded that Robb Stark renounce his claim as king in the North, kneel to Joffrey, and possibly accept a royal pardon. In return, the North might be granted some degree of autonomy, and Sansa would be sent home. Catelyn nearly spit at the suggestion. Robb responded calmly that Ned Stark had been murdered under false pretenses, and the North would not bend the knee to Joffrey. Tywin's mouth tightened. The negotiations soured. It seemed that peace was impossible. Yet a slender chance remained: a simple prisoner exchange. Jaime Lannister for Sansa Stark. Robb considered it carefully, recalling that the Kingslayer was a dangerous foe. He also remembered the vow he made to Catelyn that he would do everything in his power to rescue her daughters. But there was no sign of Arya's whereabouts. When pressed, Tywin claimed ignorance, stating that Arya was likely dead or captured by other forces. Despite misgivings, Robb finally agreed to exchange Jaime for Sansa. It was an anguished decision for him, for Jaime had been the most valuable hostage. But Sansa was his sister, a Stark of Winterfell, and leaving her to the Lannisters' mercy weighed heavily on his conscience. Tywin gave a curt nod and promised that Sansa would be sent north under guard once Jaime was safely in Lannister hands. They parted ways with no truce or peace, only this narrow agreement. The war would continue, but at least Sansa could be freed from King's Landing. When Robb returned to Riverrun, he confided in his mother. "Am I doing right by exchanging Jaime for Sansa with no other guarantee?" he asked, voice raw with doubt. Catelyn pressed his hand. "Sometimes there is no perfect choice in war, Robb. Only the choice that lets you sleep at night." The days turned into weeks as they waited for the official prisoner exchange. Jaime was prepared under close guard. Sansa's escort was arranged by Tywin. The exchange was to take place at a small holdfast near the border of the Crownlands and the Riverlands, again under parley banners. When the day arrived, Robb did not go in person. He dispatched the Blackfish and Roose Bolton, along with a cadre of men. On Tywin's side, it was Lord Kevin Lannister, Tyrion Lannister, and several knights who came to oversee the exchange. The tension was thick as stone as Jaime and Sansa were swapped. Jaime, swaggering even in captivity, made a few cutting remarks to the Northerners. Sansa, pale and quiet, looked as though she might faint. But she was alive, and she was free of King's Landing. The exchange completed, neither side lingered. Jaime rode off with his Lannister guard, looking over his shoulder with a sardonic grin. Sansa was brought to Riverrun, where she was finally reunited with Catelyn and Robb. The tears that flowed from mother and daughter were a balm to many. Sansa seemed changed, quieter, haunted by what she had seen. But she was safe in Stark hands once more. This small victory boosted morale among the northern men. They saw their king had reclaimed one of his sisters. Even the Freys regarded it as a sign that Robb Stark was a man of influence, able to extract concessions from Tywin Lannister himself. Walder Frey sent a lukewarm letter congratulating the king in the north on his sister's release. But the war was far from over. Sansa was safe, yet that did not bring Ned back, nor did it restore the Riverlands to peace. House Lannister still held the Iron Throne in King's Landing, and House Tyrells might reinforce them. With winter looming, neither side could easily mount a final, crushing blow. Time dragged on. Skirmishes continued, but on a lesser scale. The lines of battle began to freeze, both literally and figuratively, as snow and ice made campaigning in some areas nearly impossible. Robb's men continued to hold the Riverlands from full Lannister occupation, but they could not break Tywin's hold. Harrenhal changed hands once more when the mountains stormed it in a surprise attack, forcing the Blackfish to retreat. Meanwhile, Walder Frey's men dug in at the Twins, collecting tolls from travelers, and occasionally venturing out to raid any Lannister supply convoys that came too close. Throughout all of this, Robb's strategic position was clearly stronger than it would have been had he refused Walder Frey's original marriage demands. Without the Freys, he would never have been able to cross swiftly to deal with the Lannisters in the west, nor would he have had extra men to help recapture Winterfell from the Ironborn. The Freys, for all their flaws, had padded the numbers on the field, and House Frey's hold on the Twins had kept Robb's lines of communication open, aiding him in forging a corridor from the north through the Riverlands. The north itself, though scarred by the Ironborn invasions, began to recover under the watchful eye of Castellan lords who swore loyalty to Robb. Trade through White Harbor was stifled by the war, but provisions did trickle in, enough to keep Robb's armies from starving. Winterfell's reconstruction was slow, but some progress was being made, a symbol of hope for Northerners who believed in the Stark line. And so the realm found itself in a stalemate. The War of the Five Kings was no longer quite so many kings. Stannis remained a threat to the crown, but he had retreated to Dragonstone after the defeat at Blackwater. Balon Greyjoy was still styling himself King of the Isles, but his ambitions in the north had been shattered. Renly Baratheon was dead, leaving no barrier to the Tyrell-Lannister alliance. And Robb Stark still held the title king in the north, supported by his bannermen and by Walder Frey, at least in name. Robb had learned that winning a war was not the same as winning battles. He had proven himself a cunning commander and had forged alliances, all while keeping to his word. That alone had brought him farther than most would have predicted, especially after losing Ned Stark. He had broken no promise to Walder Frey. He had accepted the old man's demands, forging an unsteady but critical alliance that let him press his claim against the Lannisters. Now, as he stood on the battlements of Riverrun one gray morning, gazing out at the gentle swirl of snow falling on the red fork of the Trident, Robb reflected on all that had happened since he had crossed that bridge at the Twins. The war was not done, but he had reclaimed the North from the Ironborn, secured part of the Riverlands, and even exchanged prisoners so that Sansa was free. These were victories that would not have been possible if he had spurned Walder Frey. He wondered if the day would come when he faced Tywin Lannister in one last campaign, or if the realm would simply wither in endless skirmishes until all sides were too weak to continue. Behind him, Rosalind approached, her cheeks pink in the chill. She carried a thick cloak of wolf fur in her arms. Softly, she said, "My lord, my king. It's too cold to stand here without a cloak." She slipped it around his shoulders, and he gave her a faint smile, still not entirely comfortable with such familiarity in public. But it warmed him more than just physically. "We'll have to return north soon," Robb murmured, half to her and half to himself. "The snows will be thick, and my people will need me. But I can't abandon my mother's homeland to the Lannisters either." Rosalind laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Your people trust you, Robb. You've kept your vows as best as anyone can in such times. Whatever you decide, you have them, us, behind you." He clasped her hand in his, gazing over the blanketed countryside. The memory of the red wedding that could have been, the betrayal that never came, because he had not slighted Walder Frey, flashed in some corner of his imagination. He could almost sense, in some distant realm of possibility, that had he broken his vow, a fate far darker might have awaited him and his family. But in this world, he had secured House Frey's support by accepting that original demand. It was not a perfect alliance. The Freys were fractious, ambitious, and potentially treacherous. But they had proven useful allies in reclaiming Winterfell, in holding the crossings, and in bolstering his army. The North still stood. The war continued, but in that moment, Robb felt a rare glimmer of confidence that the future might yet be his to shape. He looked at Rosalind, his queen, with gratitude, and then closed his eyes briefly. He silently thanked the old gods that he had been wise enough or desperate enough to take the bargain when it had been offered. If his father had taught him anything, it was to keep one's word, and ironically, in keeping that word, Robb Stark had a chance to win a war that seemed hopeless at times. The ravens would fly south and north with new orders soon, for the war drums would never be quiet until a final peace was hammered out. But Robb Stark was still standing, still a king, and still with hope unbroken. The future of the North, the Riverlands, and maybe all the Seven Kingdoms now rested on that slender thread of alliances and the will of a young man who had already endured so much. In the days and weeks that followed, no one could deny that the king in the North had a genuine chance to bend the war to his will, for he had accomplished feats many believed impossible. He had outmaneuvered Tywin Lannister multiple times, captured Jaime Lannister, freed his own sister, reclaimed his ancestral seat, and forged an alliance with House Frey that held strong. The war was a roaring beast, but Robb Stark had his hand on its reins. Whether he could steer it to final victory was a question that no one, not even the gods, could answer with certainty. Yet the fact remained. By accepting Walder Frey's original demands, by swallowing his pride and forging that marriage alliance, Robb Stark had changed the course of the conflict. He was no longer a tragic figure destined to be undone by broken vows and treachery in a banquet hall. Instead, he stood at the brink of a true king's triumph, carrying the banner of the direwolf forward, determined to avenge his father, protect his people, and perhaps, if the fortunes of war were kind, unite the North and the Riverlands in peace. As the hush of a coming winter spread across the land, many small folk whispered prayers to the old gods or the Seven, hoping the war would finally end. And in the hush of that coming winter, the king in the North silently swore to himself that he would not fail them. He had chosen this path. He had honored his vows, and that, above all else, gave him the strength to stand unbowed amidst the gathering snow.